I wanted to make a solid wood top for a cabinet that I made in a previous video, and I'm pulling out some of these beech slabs that I have a few of, and usually I'd be looking to find a piece with the least knots and imperfections, but this time I'm looking for some character and interesting grain to make a bit of a feature of. These boards are about 30 years old, so they're really dry. I like the look of this piece with this curly grain and the crack at the end. And I'll pair this with this offcut of sapele for some nice contrast, and it'll tie it in nicely with a desk that I made in previous videos. I'll need a straight edge on this piece first, so I'm going to use the plunge saw for that. And I need to fit this through my planer, so I'm going to cut it down to just less than 260mm, which is the capacity of my machine. I'll be able to use this offcut to complete the top. I can cut the sapele to length, and I can start milling the timber, first planing one face of each board. And I'm really pushing the limits of this machine, as you can see here, and this would work better if my blades weren't so dull, and sharpening these planer knives is possibly something that I'll cover in a future video. And then I can get them planed to thickness, and this sapele has a nice bit of sapwood at the top, which is lighter in colour. I quite like that. So this beech slab was already pretty thin, so I'm not going to be able to get this totally clean. So I'm just concentrating on cleaning up the top show face of the board, as no one will ever see the bottom anyway, and it's more important to me to retain as much thickness as possible. Then over to the table saw to true up the edges and make sure that they're straight. So now I'm just positioning each of the boards in relation to each other, and I've got an ugly knot at the end here which I want to get rid of. I've got a couple of small knots in the centre here which I'm happy to keep, and then down the end here is where most of the character is, and I want to keep some of this crack but probably not this wider part here. At the moment the boards aren't meeting together very well. You can see particularly here I've got a huge gap in between the sapele and the beech, but then it's tight at the end. So I'm going to make some adjustments to this by hand to get them all fitting together nicely. These pencil marks will allow me to place everything back in the right place, and I'm marking up where I need to remove some material. I'm using the Stanley No. 4 hand plane for this and just checking that my edges are nice and square. I like to do this by hand and get everything fitting nicely together. It does take longer than using the planer machine, but I get better results doing it this way, especially with longer boards. And that looks much better, not perfect, but plenty good enough with glue and clamps. I mark up a triangle for realignment, and then I can get ready for the glue up. I'm not bothering with biscuits, dominoes or dowels here, there's no need, as I can align the boards just with a few taps of a mallet instead. And then I left it overnight to dry. Nice save. I cut clean edges with the plunge saw, and then I can work on filling that crack, so I get it flipped over and apply masking tape to the bottom. And I mix up some epoxy. This is just cheap stuff from a pound shop. I mix in some sawdust just to thicken it a bit, and then put a little drop of India ink in to make it black. And I can fill all of those cracks and knots. I clamped a board onto the bottom just because I noticed the masking tape was sagging a bit underneath under the weight of the epoxy. After an hour or so I came back with a hand plane to remove the excess, and there were lots of little air bubbles on the inside, so I ended up doing another coat on top just to fill the voids. This video is sponsored by Tradeify, an all-in-one job management application for busy tradespeople, available on both mobile and desktop. It's a fantastic app designed to take the hassle out of managing things like dealing with incoming inquiries, raising quotes, issuing and tracking invoices, timesheets, appointments, GPS job tracking, financial reporting and more.
For a free 14-day trial, use the link in the description box below. And if you'd also like to get 50% off Tradeify for 3 months once the trial expires, you can use the promo code RAGandBone when you sign up. I'm going to cut under bevels to the top using the plunge saw, using a 2x2 piece of timber to increase the cutting angle. I used this technique on the desktop too, and it worked well. The ridges in the bottom of the track just kind of hook over the edge naturally, which helps me to position it consistently each time, and clamps hold everything in place. I set the saw to 47 or 48 degrees, I think, whichever is the maximum tilt, and make the cuts. I decided to measure the angle this time as a few people asked about this last time, and it's 31.3 degrees. When you're making cuts like this, what you don't want to happen is for your batteries to die. And then your hose to get caught on workbench stuff. So annoying. Speaking of annoying, more sanding. Now on to something more fun. I got a piece of sapele out of the scrap bin and I'm going to make a bow tie to reinforce the crack. Whether it's actually needed or not, I'm not sure, as the epoxy is going to hold things together, but it'll be a nice feature regardless. I used the bevel gauge set to a random angle and speed square to help me mark up the shape, and then I cut it at the bandsaw. Using a sharp chisel I can then clean up those rough bandsaw blade cuts, and I cleaned up the end grain at the disc sander. Took me a while to figure out where I wanted to place it, but once I was happy I scored around it with a knife and then made the knife marks easier to see. I used a straight bit in the router to remove the bulk of the material, being careful to stay inside the lines, and did a couple of passes to get it to about 6mm in depth. And then used chisels to get to the rest. And I'm holding the chisel at a slight angle so that the recess is bigger at the bottom, which will give somewhere for the glue to go while keeping things tight at the top. Adding a bevel to the bottom of the bow tie is going to help give space for glue too. And then I add glue and hit it in place. It was a really good fit, so no need for clamps here, and I can remove the excess with a hand plane and chisel. I did have just the very tip of the corner break away, unfortunately, as you can see here, so I'm going to splice in a little bit of wood to help fill that. And once sanded it looked okay, not perfect but good enough for me. Then I started sanding at 80, 120 and then 180 grit. I like to soften the sharp edges and the corners just by hand with some 120 grit. Here I'm masking up just the sapele bits because I wanted to add some shellac just to darken and bring out the colour. I pushed the tape down really firmly, but I kind of guessed I'd get some bleeding underneath the tape, so I'm just kind of dabbing it on. And as you can see, there was a bit of bleeding, so I'm just trying to blend that in with some sandpaper. And then I'm using water-based varnish as I did for the desktops, because it's nice and hard wearing and it'll keep the beech nice and bright in colour. And I did the underside too. Usually for denibbing in between coats I use 400 grit by hand, but because of the epoxy element here I didn't want to skip any grits, so I'm going with 240 grit first and then some 400 by hand. I brushed away the dust and then applied a final coat. It didn't seem worth setting up the spray gun just for this, and I can get a really nice finish just with a half decent quality brush and the denibbing between coats. Here's how it looks, and now it's ready to install. As you can see, I've been using the cabinet without a top, but adding this will tie it in nicely with the desk. And I'm drilling pilot holes through the legs at the front, but at the back I drill a wider hole with an auger bit, which is just to let the top expand and contract by a couple of millimeters as the seasons change. Those wider holes just need a washer to hold the screw head, and it's done. Please subscribe to the channel for more videos if you'd like to help support the channel, plus get early access to my videos, exclusive content, free project plans and cut lists, and a name credit at the end of my videos. You'll find links to my Patreon and YouTube channel membership in the description box below. Thanks for watching.